verse 6, Paul and Barnabas were to become aware of what was happening. They found out about this plot against them and they fled. So where did they go? Well, it's quite interesting, but because they didn't go that far, because if you're looking on a map, they followed into the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the good news. So the rebellion against them was basically in Iconium, but that didn't stop them. Come on, that didn't stop them. All right, they fled, because if they'd been stoned, yes, as you can see later, they could have died. So to save their lives, they fled, but they didn't flee and stop preaching. They fled in order to evangelize and become missionaries and spread the gospel further afoot. So they are now in the whole of the countryside surrounding Iconium, in Lystra and Derbe and so on, and they continued to preach the good news. I mean, this is good news. You see, sometimes I don't think people fully understand that, you know, if you look at this, and I shall eventually come to deal with this issue, that the Jewish religion was a very constricting religion. It had its laws, and as we shall see, it had its laws, and you had to obey the laws. But what Paul and Barnabas, along with the other apostles, are preaching is a message of deliverance and freedom, that you're not saved by good works or by keeping the law. You're saved by faith in the resurrection of Jesus, that he is the Messiah. And when you come to verse 8, look at the demonstration. In Lystra, there sat a man crippled in his feet, lame from birth. He was born like it, that's what it means bluntly. He was born a cripple. He'd never walked. If you're born a cripple, you don't walk. Okay. He, in verse 9, listened to Paul who was speaking. And Paul, although he's speaking to a crowd, looks directly at this crippled man and recognized and saw, and this is quite interesting when you read it, saw that he had faith to be healed. Now you have to understand, it was so much like this in the time of Jesus, that Jesus would meet the people who didn't know him. I mean, you know, I think it was blind Bartimaeus that they said, who healed you? I don't know, I haven't seen him, because he hadn't seen Jesus at that time. The blind man, when Jesus healed him, didn't know who had healed him, until eventually they saw and recognized it was Jesus. And so here, you've got this man who doesn't say whether he's Jewish or Gentile. It simply says that he was listening, and somehow God gave him that precious gift of faith that he could be healed. It's obvious that Paul is witnessing about the miracles that were happening. You know, this is part of my ministry, is to witness of the miracles that happen everywhere I go. They're phenomenal, and we should testify. And so the result was, he had faith to be healed, and Paul simply called out to the man. He didn't lay his hands on him. You know, people seem to think sometimes that there's a formula in healing. No, there isn't. Yes, the Bible does speak to the church and says, any is sick among you, let them call for the elders of the church, anoint them with oil, and the prayer of faith will save the sick. But that doesn't happen with the evangelists. I don't anoint sick people in preaching the gospel with oil. I don't. I pray for the sick and command them to be healed. And they are, in their tens of thousands. And so that all that Paul is doing is saying, stand up. Get up, stand up. And the amazing thing is, in this here, it's in verse 10, it's amazing. When he heard that, the man obeyed and got up and began to walk. Oh, if only people, I sometimes find it's easier to see unbelievers healed than Christians. And I must say this, that sometimes I get Christians who come for prayer for different reasons, many times. But sometimes I say to them, have you been prayed for before? And they'll say, oh, yes, I've been prayed for many times. And I say, were you healed? No. Well, why are you expecting to be healed now then? It's a serious challenge. But if you deal with unbelievers, they don't have that unbelief because nobody's done this before. This is something new, and it's easy for them to accept in faith, and the miracle happens. I see more miracles amongst unbelievers than believers, sadly. But that doesn't mean that believers can't be healed. I've been healed twice of cancer, and let me tell you, I was a very strong believer. I was an evangelist on both cases. So the man jumped up and walked. So when you come to verse 11, look at the reaction. You begin to see why God is doing this. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." It's quite important when I read over the next bits here. Too often, evangelists try to claim that they're the miracle workers. I don't. I say something which theoretically is not scriptural. When I'm preaching the gospel and praying for the sick, I say to the people, I am not a healer. Jesus is the healer. And so often I say, no, I will not lay hands on you. I want you to obey Scripture, which says in the Gospels, these signs that will follow those that believe, they'll lay hands on the sick and they will be healed. And I tell the people to lay hands on their own sickness, and I pray with them, and then the miracles happen, because it's not me, it's Jesus they're looking to. So here, no, they're looking to Paul. So they're saying the gods have come down to us in human form. I like what they did. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, you have to remember that we had massive idolatry in these days, massive idolatry. So the temple of Zeus was just outside the city, and the priests brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because they wanted to offer sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas. And in verse 13, when the apostles heard of this, they tore their clothes, rushed out in the crowd, shouting, "Men, why are you doing this? We're only men like you. We're humans. We're not gods. We're bringing you good news. We're telling you to turn from these worthless religions to the living God." It shocks me at the way that people will bow down and worship images and gods that do nothing. Those guys, these gods, you can make sacrifices, it doesn't do any good because they're just wood or stone or whatever. There's no life in them. They can do nothing. They might be images of some fanciful gods, but those gods don't exist anyway. And this is where Paul is saying, we're bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless gods and religions, because they're dealing with the gods Zeus and Hermes. Why are you doing this? We're turning you from these worthless, valueless, empty temples to the living God. We don't worship idols and images. We don't worship any images. We're worshiping a living God.